Sophie Bennett sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the letter for what felt like the 100th time. The paper was slightly crumpled from how many times she had folded and unfolded it, as if she expected the words to somehow change. But they didn't. Family reunion. September 20th. Attendance mandatory. Bring your husband, or be prepared to discuss why you still don't have one. Grandma Eleanor. Her grandmother's handwriting was elegant and sharp, like the woman herself. Sophie groaned and let her head fall dramatically onto the table. At 27, Sophie had a lot of things going for her. A decent job as an event planner, a small but cozy apartment, and a tight-knit circle of friends who loved her. But there was one thing she didn't have, one thing her grandmother wouldn't let her forget: a husband. In Grandma Eleanor's world, marriage was a mark of success, a symbol that you were living life the right way. Every family reunion was the same, relatives parading their spouses and children around like trophies, while Sophie became the subject of endless pitying glances and passive-aggressive remarks. Last year had been the worst. "Still single, dear?" her Aunt Mildred had asked in a voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You know, men aren't going to wait forever. You should settle down before it's too late." It wasn't just humiliating, it was exhausting. But this year was different. This wasn't just another family gathering. It was a reading of the will for her late grandfather's estate. The countryside house Sophie grew up visiting every summer, the one place that still felt like home, was at stake. According to family tradition, the property would go to the family member who appeared to have the most stable life. In other words, whoever looked happiest, wealthiest, and most settled would get the house. Sophie's cousins were already posting photos of their picture-perfect families on Instagram, practically campaigning for the inheritance. Sophie couldn't bear the thought of losing the house to them. It wasn't about money, it was about memories. She remembered running through those fields as a child, baking cookies with her grandmother in that kitchen, hiding under the big oak tree with her best friend on summer nights. That house was the last connection she had to her parents, who had died when she was 15. She had to win. But how? She didn't have a boyfriend, let alone a husband. She didn't have a shiny engagement ring or a perfect Instagram-worthy life. Sophie leaned back in her chair, chewing her lip, her mind racing. She had 1 week left, 1 week to find someone willing to stand by her side and play the part of the perfect husband, even if it was just for 3 days. At first, she considered asking one of her guy friends, but that felt risky. What if they took it the wrong way, or worse, told everyone about her plan? Then she thought about hiring a professional actor. She even Googled rent a boyfriend services, only to find the prices astronomical, far beyond what she could afford on her modest salary. Frustration bubbled inside her. "This is insane," she muttered aloud. "People don't just hire random strangers to be their husbands." And yet, the thought stuck. What if she did? Her mind began spinning with possibilities. She didn't need someone perfect, just someone who could smile, shake hands, and pretend to be madly in love with her for a weekend. Someone who wouldn't embarrass her in front of her family. The more she thought about it, the more the idea seemed possible. But it was still terrifying. What if the man turned out to be a creep? What if he said something ridiculous and ruined everything? What if her family found out it was fake? Sophie pushed back on the table and paced her small apartment, muttering to herself like a madwoman. "Okay," Sophie breathed. "You plan weddings for a living. You can plan a fake marriage for 3 days." She grabbed a notebook and started jotting down requirements. Requirement number 1. Must be presentable. At least look like someone who could realistically be her husband. Requirement number 2. Must be polite. Her grandmother was old-fashioned and easily offended. Requirement number 3. Must not be overly charming. She didn't want her aunts throwing themselves at him. Requirement number 4. Must agree to keep things strictly professional. She tapped her pen against the paper. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Now where do I find a man like this in less than a week?" She tried dating apps, swiping through profile after profile, but quickly gave up. Too slow, too creepy, too complicated. She thought about asking coworkers, but that seemed like a one-way ticket to office gossip. By the time night fell, Sophie was curled up on her couch, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed. The clock was ticking, and she was running out of options. That's when the rain started. It came suddenly, pounding against her windows in a torrential downpour. Sophie sighed and stood up, pulling on her coat. She was out of coffee, and if she was going to survive this week, caffeine was non-negotiable. She grabbed her umbrella and headed to the little cafe down the street, the one that stayed open late and always smelled like cinnamon rolls. She had no idea that this simple decision would change her entire life. The rain hadn't let up. By the time Sophie pushed open the door to the cafe, her umbrella was dripping and her hair was a mess of damp waves clinging to her cheeks. The bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped inside, greeted by the warm aroma of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked bread. The cafe was quiet for a Saturday night, with only a handful of patrons scattered across the cozy space. A couple sat by the window, speaking in hushed tones, while an older man read a newspaper near the fireplace. Sophie shook off her umbrella and made her way to the counter, brushing a stray lock of hair out of her face. "Rough night?" the barista asked with a sympathetic smile. "You have no idea," Sophie muttered, pulling out her wallet. "Large latte, extra shot, please." As she waited for her drink, she glanced around, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on a man sitting alone in the corner booth, partially hidden in the shadows. He was hard to miss, not because he was flashy, but because he seemed completely at ease, as though the storm raging outside didn't bother him in the slightest. He sat with one arm draped casually across the back of the booth, staring out the rain-streaked window as if lost in thought. Sophie's first impression was that he didn't belong there. His clothes were simple, a dark, fitted jacket over a plain white shirt, but something about the way he wore them suggested quality, like they were tailored to fit him perfectly. His posture was relaxed but alert, like someone used to being aware of his surroundings. His jawline was sharp, his hair slightly tousled, as though he just stepped out of a magazine photo shoot without trying. She quickly looked away, embarrassed at having stared. The barista called her name, and she grabbed her latte, sinking into the nearest empty seat. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She still hadn't figured out how she was going to find a husband in less than a week. Her phone buzzed. It was a group chat notification from her cousins. Another photo of their picture-perfect families posing in front of their vacation homes. "Can't wait for the reunion next weekend." One of them had captioned the photo with a smug smile emoji. Sophie groaned under her breath and dropped her phone on the table. Across the cafe, the man in the corner shifted his gaze toward her. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, it felt like he could see straight through her. Sophie quickly looked away again, heat rising to her cheeks. But then something strange happened. He stood up, grabbed his coffee, and walked toward her table. Sophie's heart leapt into her throat. Was he coming over here? Sure enough, he stopped right in front of her table, his tall frame casting a shadow across her seat. "The seat taken?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. Sophie blinked. No. Go ahead." He slid into the chair across from her, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "You look like someone who just lost a battle," he said casually, glancing at her damp hair and the frustrated look on her face. Sophie gave a humorless laugh, more like someone who's losing a war. That earned a slight smile from him, just a hint, tugging at the corner of his lips. "Care to share?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Normally, Sophie wasn't the type to pour her heart out to strangers, but something about him felt safe. Or maybe she was just desperate. "It's complicated," she said with a sigh, taking a sip of her latte. "I have a family reunion next weekend. My grandmother thinks I'm married. I may have implied that I was, to get her off my back." His eyebrows lifted slightly, though his expression stayed calm. "Let me guess. Now you need to produce a husband?" Sophie stared at him, surprised. "How did you know?" He shrugged, that faint smile still on his lips. "You don't look like the type to panic over nothing. So either you're planning a crime or you're planning a cover-up." Sophie laughed to spite herself. "More like a performance. I just need someone pretend to be my husband for 3 days, smile at my family, and keep me from losing my mind." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She froze, realizing how insane she must sound. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Forget I said anything. But instead of looking shocked or uncomfortable, the man tilted his head thoughtfully, studying her. "You really need this, don't you?" he said softly. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "If I don't show up with a husband, my entire family will spend the whole weekend tearing me apart. And there's this house, my grandparents' house. It's kind of up for grabs. Whoever looks the most stable gets it." Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even a hint of admiration. "And you're willing to hire a stranger to play the part?" Sophie gave a helpless shrug. "Do you know anyone?" There was a brief pause, and then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I could do it," he said simply. Sophie blinked, startled. "Wait, what?" "I'll be your husband," he said, as if he were offering to pass the salt. Sophie's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. You don't even know me." "That's true," he admitted, completely calm. "But you don't know me either. Maybe that's the point." Sophie stared at him, trying to read his expression. He didn't look like he was joking. "Why would you even want to do this?" she asked, suspicious. He hesitated, then gave a half-smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I have some free time, and a good reason to stay out of sight for a while." The answer was cryptic, but Sophie was too overwhelmed to press. "I'll pay you," she said quickly. He shook his head. "Not necessary, but I do have one condition." Sophie swallowed. "What is it?" "No personal questions," he said firmly. "No digging into who I am, where I come from, or why I agreed. You just need someone to play a part, right? Let's keep it simple." Sophie hesitated. Every instinct told her this was crazy. He was a total stranger. For all she knew, he could be dangerous. But something in his voice, calm, steady, almost reassuring, made her feel like she could trust him. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay, no personal questions." He extended his hand across the table. "Deal." Sophie stared at his hand for a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, warm, and strangely grounding. "Deal," she said quietly. As they released hands, Sophie felt a strange rush of adrenaline. She had just made the most impulsive decision of her life, hiring a man she'd met less than 10 minutes ago to be her husband for the weekend. But as she watched him stand, his confident yet unassuming presence filling the room, Sophie had the strangest feeling that she hadn't just made a reckless choice, she had set something much bigger into motion, something she couldn't take back. The following Friday, Sophie found herself gripping the steering wheel of her little blue car, so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is insane," she muttered to herself for the 10th time as she drove down the winding country road toward her grandmother's estate. In the passenger seat, Ethan sat calm as ever, one hand casually resting on his knee, the other scrolling through something on his phone. He was dressed in a crisp navy shirt and tailored slacks that looked suspiciously expensive, despite his insistence that he didn't want to stand out. His dark hair was perfectly tousled in that effortless way that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a catalog. Sophie, on the other hand, was a mess. Her hair refused to stay pinned. Her palms were sweaty, and she couldn't stop running through all the possible ways this could go horribly wrong. "What if they don't believe us?" she blurted suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up from his phone, completely unfazed. "Then we make them believe us." "That's not exactly comforting." "You asked me to be your husband, Sophie," he reminded her with a hint of amusement in his voice. "Trust me, I know how to play a part." Something about the quiet confidence in his tone made her stomach flip. As they turned into the long driveway leading up to the estate, Sophie's heart pounded harder. The big white country house loomed ahead, surrounded by green fields and ancient oak trees. It was exactly as she remembered from her childhood, warm, beautiful, and intimidating all at once. Before she could gather her thoughts, the front door burst open and several relatives spilled out onto the porch. "There she is." Aunt Mildred's shrill voice rang out. Sophie plastered on a bright smile, forcing her nerves down, and climbed out of the car. Ethan followed, stepping around to her side with a calm, deliberate grace that made Sophie's relatives collectively pause. "This is Ethan," Sophie announced, her voice higher than usual. "My husband." There was a moment of stunned silence before Grandma Eleanor stepped forward, her sharp eyes raking over Ethan from head to toe. "Well," she said finally. "You certainly took your time introducing us to him." Ethan didn't flinch. He smiled politely and held out his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you, ma'am. Sophie's told me so much about you." Grandma Eleanor's eyebrow arched ever so slightly, but she took his hand. Well, let's hope she told you only the good things." That broke the tension just enough for the rest of the family to swarm them with questions. "How did you two meet? When did you get married? Why didn't you invite us to the wedding?" Sophie opened her mouth to answer, but Ethan spoke first, smoothly, confidently, as if he had rehearsed for weeks. "We met at a charity event," he said with a faint smile. "She spilled coffee on me, actually. I suppose you could say it was love at first stain." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Sophie blinked at him, impressed. He was completely in control, deflecting every question with charm and humor. When Cousin Jessica asked what he did for work, he simply said, "I run a few businesses, nothing too exciting," and steered the conversation back to Sophie, making her the center of attention in the best possible way. Within an hour, Ethan had charmed every single person in the house, even Aunt Mildred, who spent years criticizing Sophie's every life choice. By dinner time, Sophie found herself watching him from across the table, almost forgetting that this was all fake. He laughed at her uncle's terrible jokes, helped Grandma Eleanor to her seat, and even complimented Cousin Tom's overcooked pot roast without flinching. He didn't just play the role of a husband. He played the role of a man who adored Sophie. At one point, he casually reached over and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, murmuring, "You're doing great," in a low voice meant just for her. The gesture was so natural, so intimate, that Sophie's breath caught. For a moment, she forgot that they were putting on a show. Later that evening, after the dishes had been cleared and the family settled in the living room, Sophie and Ethan found themselves sitting together on the old couch by the fireplace. "Are you always as good at lying?" she asked, half teasing, half serious. He smirked. "It's not lying if we make it real enough to believe." Sophie gave him a look. That's a very unsettling answer. But deep down, she couldn't deny the way her chest warmed at his words. As the night wore on, Ethan's presence made everything easier. When her cousins made snide comments about Sophie's career being unstable, Ethan jumped in with a smooth defense. "Sophie's one of the best planners I've ever met," he said confidently. "You should see her in action. She can organize an entire wedding down to the last detail without breaking a sweat." Sophie felt her throat tighten at the unexpected praise. No man had ever defended her like that before, certainly not in front of her family. The longer the evening went, the more she found herself laughing at his jokes, leaning into his shoulder, forgetting where the act ended and reality began. And then came the moment that sealed it. Grandma Eleanor asked if they would share a dance, a long-standing family tradition, after dinner. Sophie started to protest, but Ethan took her hand before she could. "I'd be honored," he said smoothly. The living room lights dimmed, and someone put on an old record. Ethan led her to the center of the room, his hand resting gently on her waist. "You don't have to look so terrified," he murmured. "I'm not terrified," Sophie whispered back, though her pounding heart betrayed her. They began to sway to the soft music. His movements were effortless, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Sophie found herself relaxing, letting him guide her. When she glanced up, their eyes met, and something shifted. It wasn't just a performance anymore. The way he was looking at her, the way his thumb brushed lightly against her waist, it felt too real. She didn't pull away. When the song ended, Sophie's cheeks were warm, her breath uneven. The room erupted in applause, but she barely heard it. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, Sophie found herself standing alone on the porch, staring out at the moonlit fields. Ethan stepped outside and joined her, hands in his pockets. "You handled today well," he said quietly. "So did you," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. For a moment, they stood in silence, the cool night air brushing against them. "You know," Ethan said finally, "you don't have to keep trying so hard to impress them. You're already enough." Sophie turned to look at him, startled by the sincerity in his tone. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked. He gave a small, almost wistful smile. "Because I can tell you don't hear it enough." Her chest ached at his words. She wanted to ask more, to break the rule and dig into who he really was. But she held back. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." When they went back inside, Sophie knew something had changed between them. They had started this weekend as strangers playing a part. But tonight, under the soft glow of the moonlight, they had begun to feel like something more. The second day of the reunion dawned warm and golden, sunlight streaming through the gauzy curtains of Sophie's childhood bedroom. She woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Then it all came rushing back. The deal, the family dinner, the dance by the fireplace. Ethan's hand steady on her waist, the strange look in his eyes that had left her breathless. Her heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. This was supposed to be simple. 3 days of pretending, 3 days of smiles and fake backstory, then back to her real life. But already on day 2, things felt more complicated than they should. Downstairs, the house was buzzing with activity. The smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast wafted from the kitchen. Sophie patted down the stairs and paused when she heard laughter. Deep, rich laughter that made her stomach twist. Ethan was in the kitchen. He stood by the stove, effortlessly flipping pancakes with one hand, while chatting with her grandmother, who watched him with barely concealed approval. "I didn't know you could cook," Sophie said, crossing her arms and leaning against the doorway. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and flashed her a grin. "There are a lot of things you don't know about me." That was true. Too true. Her grandmother turned to her. Her usually stern face softened. "You've done well, Sophie." "He's different from what I expected." Sophie managed a small smile and joined him at the table. Ethan set a plate of pancakes in front of her, sliding into the chair beside her like they'd been doing this for years. "Eat," he said simply. Something about the way he said it, calm, almost protective, made Sophie obey without question. As the morning went on, Ethan somehow managed to charm every last relative. He played croquet with her uncle, helped her younger cousins fix a kite, and even endured a full hour of Aunt Mildred's gossip without flinching. Sophie watched from a distance, amazed. He wasn't just pretending anymore. He was becoming part of her world, and that scared her. By afternoon, the heat had driven most of the family indoors for naps and quiet time. Sophie retreated to the porch with a book, but she couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the man who was, for all intents and purposes, her husband. As if summoned by her thoughts, Ethan appeared, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to her, without a word, and sat down on the porch step, stretching his legs. "Thanks," she said softly. For a while, they just sat there in companionable silence, listening to cicadas hum in the trees. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "You're really good at this." "At what?" he asked without looking at her. "This. Playing the perfect husband. It's like you've done it before." He chuckled under his breath. "Maybe I've had practice." She turned to study him. Curious. His face was calm, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "You don't talk about yourself much," she said carefully. "That was the deal, remember? No personal questions." "I know," she admitted, then hesitated. "But I wish I knew more. Like, what made you say yes? Why you're really here?" Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the horizon for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost reflective. "Because for once, I want to be just someone, not who people expect me to be. Not the guy everyone watches, judges, talks about. Just a man, sitting on a porch with a woman who doesn't know his whole story." Sophie's breath caught. There was a heaviness in his tone that made her chest ache. She wanted to ask more, wanted to pry past the walls he had so carefully built. But she held back. Instead, she simply said, "Well, you're doing a good job at being just a man." That earned her a real smile, one that reached his eyes this time. Later that night, after another big family dinner, Sophie found herself standing by the fireplace, nursing a glass of wine. The house had grown quiet, most of the relatives having gone to bed. She nearly jumped when Ethan appeared beside her, his presence quiet but commanding. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too many thoughts." He glanced at her glass. Wine helping. Not really, she admitted with a laugh. Without a word, he took the glass from her and set it on the mantel. Come on, he said, extending a hand. Sophie frowned. Come on where? Outside. I'm not going outside with you in the middle of the night. Why not? He asked, that infuriatingly calm smile tugging at his lips. Because it feels too real, Sophie wanted to say. Because if I spend one more minute alone with you, I might forget this is fake. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she found herself slipping on her shoes and following him out into the night. The air was cool and crisp, the stars glittering overhead like diamonds. Ethan led her down the familiar path toward the big oak tree at the edge of the property. The same tree where Sophie had played as a child. Why are we here? She whispered. Because you look like you need to breathe, he said simply. She sat down on the grass, and he joined her, their shoulders nearly touching. For a while, they just sat there in silence, looking up at the stars. This place means a lot to you, doesn't it? He said quietly. It's everything, Sophie admitted. When my parents died, this house was the only place that still felt safe. Losing it would be like losing them all over again. Ethan turned his head to look at her, his expression unreadable. You deserve to keep it, he said firmly. The conviction in his voice surprised her. You really think so? I know so, he said. You're the only one fighting for it for the right reasons. Sophie swallowed hard, blinking back sudden tears. You're not supposed to make me cry, she said with a weak laugh. Sorry, he said, though his tone didn't sound sorry at all. Silence stretched between them, soft and charged. When Sophie finally looked at him, she found his gaze already on her. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The quiet night, the stars, and the man sitting beside her, closer than he'd ever been. If this was supposed to be pretend, it didn't feel like it anymore. She wanted to lean closer, wanted to close the distance, but she didn't. Instead, she looked away, her heart thundering. When they walked back to the house, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had happened out there under the stars. This was no longer just about fooling her family. This was about them. And Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready for what that meant. Sophie woke to the sound of voices. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Muffled chatter, hurried footsteps, the faint rumble of engines outside. But then she heard her grandmother's sharp voice from the hallway. Who are all these people? Heart pounding. Sophie threw on a sweater and hurried downstairs. The house was in chaos. Relatives peering through curtains. Aunt Mildred clutching her pearls dramatically. Cousin Jessica squealing with delight, as though this was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to her. What's going on? Sophie asked breathlessly. Her uncle pointed toward the front windows. You'd better see for yourself. Sophie pushed past him and peeked through the curtain. Her stomach dropped. The driveway was swarming with people, photographers, cameramen, reporters holding microphones. Bright camera flashes lit up the early morning light like fireworks. And at the center of it all were several large black SUVs, parked like they owned the place. What the hell? Sophie whispered. Before she could process anything, there was a commotion at the door. One of the SUVs had opened, and several imposing men in suits stepped out, speaking into earpieces. They looked like security. What is this, a movie set? Aunt Mildred shrieked, and then Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs. He was already dressed, looking calm, too calm, as he descended the steps. What's happening? Sophie demanded, rushing toward him. Ethan's eyes met hers, unreadable. They found me. What do you mean, found you? She asked, her voice rising. Who are they? He hesitated, then exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself. Sophie, he said carefully, there's something I need to tell you. The world seemed to hold its breath. I'm not just some random guy you met in a cafe, he continued. My full name is Ethan Hartwell. Sophie blinked, the name sparking vague recognition. Should I know who that is? She asked cautiously. Ethan's lips curved into a humorless smile. Probably. My family owns Hartwell Global. It took a moment for the words to sink in. Hartwell Global, the multinational conglomerate that owned everything from luxury hotels to tech companies to shipping lines. The name was on skyscrapers, billboards, even magazines. And suddenly, it clicked. Why he carried himself the way he did, why his clothes looked expensive even when they were casual, why he seemed so unshakably calm in every situation. "You're a billionaire," Sophie whispered. Ethan didn't deny it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "You're a billionaire, and you didn't think to tell me before agreeing to spend a weekend pretending to be my husband?" "I told you no personal questions," he reminded her gently. "That's not an answer." Sophie's voice cracked. Before she could say more, the doorbell rang, loud, insistent. Ethan glanced toward the window, his jaw tightening. "That'll be the press. Word must have leaked that I'm here. My family security team probably tipped them off trying to get me back to the city." "Get you back?" Sophie echoed, her mind spinning. "I left without telling anyone where I was going," Ethan admitted. "I needed space. I needed to be someone else for a while." Sophie stared at him, shock and betrayal warring inside her. "So what was I? Your little vacation from reality? Your way to play normal guy for a few days?" Ethan flinched but didn't look away. "You were more than that." But Sophie wasn't listening anymore. All she could hear were the voices outside, the constant clicking of cameras, the sound of her perfect plan crumbling around her. Her family was already whispering in the background, their faces a mixture of shock, fascination, and thinly veiled judgment. Aunt Mildred was practically giddy. "Well, Sophie, you certainly know how to pick them. A secret billionaire. Who knew?" Grandma Eleanor said nothing, her expression unreadable as she studied Ethan like a hawk. "I can't deal with this," Sophie muttered, turning on her heel. She stormed out the back door, desperate for air. Ethan followed her, his footsteps steady on the porch. "Sophie, don't." She spun around to face him, her eyes blazing. "You lied to me." "I never lied," he said calmly. "I just didn't tell you everything." "That's the same thing," she snapped. "You let me humiliate myself in front of my entire family, dragging a total stranger here to pretend to be my husband, when the whole time you were a man who wanted a break from his life." Ethan finished quietly. Sophie froze. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Do you know what it's like to have every move you make monitored? Every decision judged? People pretending to like you just because of what you own? I wanted one weekend where I wasn't Ethan Hartwell, billionaire heir. I just wanted to be Ethan." Sophie's anger wavered, but only slightly. "You should have told me," she whispered. "You wouldn't have said yes if I had." She hated that he was probably right. The sound of voices drew closer, reporters circling the house, calling out Ethan's name. "This is a nightmare," Sophie muttered, running a hand through her hair. "They're going to think I'm some gold digger who tricked you into marrying me." "I'll handle it," Ethan said firmly. "How?" "You're going to walk out there and tell them that you voluntarily married a random woman you met in a coffee shop. If that's what it takes to protect you, yes." Something about the way he said it, protective, unwavering, made Sophie's heart lurch. But she couldn't think about that now. She turned away, blinking back tears. "I need some space." Ethan didn't try to stop her this time. She slipped around the side of the house and disappeared into the grove of trees, her chest tight, her mind spinning. This was supposed to be simple. 3 days. Pretend. Smile. Get through the reunion. But now, the entire country would know her name, and whether she wanted it or not, her fake marriage had just become very, very real. Sophie stayed hidden among the trees for what felt like hours. The sun was higher in the sky now, dappling light across the forest floor, but she barely noticed. She sat on an old log, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to still the storm raging inside her. Anger, humiliation, betrayal, and worst of all, a creeping ache that felt dangerously close to heartbreak. This was supposed to be simple, she whispered to herself. Her plan had been so straightforward. Hire a stranger, survive 3 days of family scrutiny, secure her inheritance, and go back to her quiet life. No drama, no chaos, no risks. Instead, she had somehow become the unwilling co-star in a national scandal. Reporters outside, camera flashes, questions about her mystery marriage. It was too much. And underneath all of it was the worst part of all. Ethan's words replaying in her head. You were more than that, more than a distraction, more than a fake wife. But could she trust that? Could she trust him? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She stiffened, bracing herself. But it wasn't Ethan this time. It was Grandma Eleanor. The elderly woman moved slowly, her cane tapping lightly against the ground as she made her way toward Sophie. Figured I'd find you here, she said quietly, easing herself down onto the log beside Sophie. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. I just needed to get away. I know. Eleanor's sharp eyes softened. You look like your mother when you're angry. Same little crease in your forehead. Sophie let out a shaky laugh. Mom never had to deal with paparazzi in her front yard. True, Eleanor said, patting her granddaughter's knee. But she did have to deal with heartbreak and secrets and learning that love doesn't always come the way you expect it. Sophie glanced at her sharply. Love? This isn't love. This is a disaster. Is it? Eleanor asked mildly. Sophie froze. Her grandmother continued, her tone calm but firm. I've seen the way that man looks at you, and I've seen the way you look at him, whether you realize it or not. Pretend all you want, but there's nothing fake about that. Sophie's throat tightened. He lied to me, she whispered. No, Eleanor corrected gently. He kept a part of himself hidden. There's a difference. Sophie looked away, fighting tears. Eleanor squeezed her hand. You have to decide what matters more, the fact that he didn't tell you everything or the fact that he stayed, even when he could have walked away. Sophie didn't know how to respond. When Eleanor finally stood to go back to the house, she left Sophie with one last piece of advice. Don't run from something just because it scares you. The best things in life usually do. Inside the house, Ethan stood in the guest room, staring out the window at the chaos beyond the gate. The press hadn't left. Reporters were shouting questions. Flashes were still going off every few minutes. And security guards were doing their best to keep everyone back. He hated it. Not the attention. He was used to that. He hated that Sophie was out there somewhere, hurting because of him. He had wanted to protect her from his world. That was why he hadn't told her who he was in the beginning. His name, his money. Those things had ruined plenty of relationships before. People always saw the fortune first, the man second. But Sophie, she had treated him like a regular person. And now she probably hated him. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Grandma Eleanor. She's out by the grove, Eleanor said without preamble. She's upset, but she's not gone. Ethan nodded, grateful. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Do you care about her? Yes. There was no hesitation in his voice. Then fight for her. Ethan's brow furrowed. She told me she needed space. Space isn't the same thing as giving up, Eleanor said. Sometimes you have to let a woman know you're not going anywhere, even if she pushes you away first. When she left, Ethan sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. Fight for her. It sounded simple. But Ethan had spent most of his life being careful. Careful with his image. Careful with his decisions. Careful not to give anyone a weapon they could use against him. Sophie made him want to throw all that caution away. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, Sophie finally returned to the house. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy, but she walked with quiet determination. The reporters were still outside, though security had managed to push them further down the drive. Inside, the family was gathered in the living room, talking in hushed voices. Ethan stood as soon as Sophie entered, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said softly. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. They stepped out onto the porch, where it was quiet. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But I need you to know I didn't come here to play with your life. I came because I needed to be someone real for once. And then I met you and it stopped being an act. Sophie's breath caught. You think that makes it okay? She asked, her voice shaking. No, Ethan admitted, but I think it means this is worth fighting for. He took a step closer. Let me deal with the media. Let me make this right. Sophie's heart twisted. Part of her wanted to run, to tell him no, to end the entire charade right there and retreat back into the safe, simple life she'd always known. But another part of her, the part that had sat under the stars with him the night before, the part that felt something more than pretend, wanted to believe him. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then let me prove it." And for the first time all day, Sophie felt something other than anger. She felt hope. By morning, Ethan had made his decision. He had spent half the night sitting in the study with the lights off, staring at the glowing screen of his phone, ignoring the dozens of texts and missed calls from his family's PR team. Every instinct told him to keep quiet, to let the storm pass and go back to the city where things could be controlled. But Sophie's face haunted him. The way she had looked at him on the porch last night, hurt and uncertain, like he had shattered something precious. This wasn't about PR. This wasn't about damage control. This was about her. When dawn broke, Ethan was already dressed in his tailored suit, the first time Sophie had seen him in anything so formal since he arrived. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice tight. "No," Ethan said, meeting her eyes. "I'm going out there." Her brows furrowed. "Out where?" "To talk to them." Her heart skipped a beat. "You mean the reporters?" He nodded once. "Ethan, that's insane. They'll twist whatever you say and turn it into something even worse." "Maybe," he admitted, adjusting his cufflinks. "But right now, they're making up their own story. And every hour we say nothing, it gets worse. If I don't tell the truth, they'll keep coming after you." Sophie froze. "You're doing this for me?" she asked softly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm doing this because you don't deserve to be the villain in this story. Not when all you did was try to save your family's home." Her breath caught. There was again that infuriating, disarming mix of protectiveness and sincerity that made it impossible to hate him completely. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when she saw Grandma Eleanor standing nearby, watching with quiet approval. "Go on, then," Eleanor said. "Show them who you really are." The reporters were waiting just beyond the gates when Ethan stepped outside. Cameras immediately started flashing, voices shouting questions. "Mr. Hartwell, are you really married? Who is she? Is it true she tricked you into marrying her? Are you getting an annulment?" Ethan raised a hand, and surprisingly, the crowd went quiet. "I'll make a statement," he said clearly, his voice carrying over the commotion, "and then I won't be answering any more questions." He stepped in front of the microphones, looking calm but unyielding. "My name is Ethan Hartwell," he began, his tone measured. "Yes, I am here at this house. Yes, I am married to Sophie." The crowd erupted in noise again, but Ethan held up a hand. "No, she didn't trick me," he said firmly, his voice rising over questions. "No, this wasn't a publicity stunt. Sophie is not after my family's money or our name. If anything, I asked her to let me stay. I came here because I needed a break from a world that sees me as nothing but a headline. Sophie gave me that, no questions asked." The flashes slowed as the reporters leaned in, listening. "Whatever story you've been writing about her is wrong," Ethan continued, his voice steady but fierce. "She is the most genuine person I've ever met. She took me into her life, into her family, expecting nothing in return. If you want to talk about manipulation, talk about me. I'm the one who hid who I was, not her." Sophie stood on the porch, frozen. Every word he spoke was like a thread, stitching her shattered heart back together. Ethan took a step closer to the cameras, his eyes like steel. "So, if you want a story," he said, "here it is. A man fell in love with a woman who saw him as a person, not a bank account. If you call that scandalous, that says more about you than it does about us." The last word hung in the air. Us. Ethan turned on his heel and walked back toward the house, ignoring the barrage of follow-up questions. When he reached the porch, Sophie was still standing there, her hand pressed to her mouth. "You," her voice broke. "You told him we're in love." Ethan's expression softened as he stepped closer. "I told him the truth," he said quietly. "At least, the part one finally figured out." Her heart thudded in her chest. "You figured it out?" she whispered. That's somewhere between pretending to be your husband and actually feeling like your husband, he said with a faint smile. I stopped acting. Sophie's throat tightened. You can't just say things like that in front of the entire country, she said weakly. Why not? Ethan asked, his gaze steady. It's how I feel. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the world around them fading away. Finally, Sophie let out a shaky laugh. You're impossible. Maybe, Ethan said, stepping closer until he was only a breath away. But I'm not leaving. Not unless you tell me to. Her breath hitched. She could feel every emotion warring inside her. Fear, relief, hope, longing. And then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Ethan's shoulders relaxed, as though he'd been holding his breath all morning. Okay, he repeated softly. Okay, she said again, a small smile tugging at her lips. Ethan didn't waste another second. He reached for her, pulling her against him, and kissed her, not as part of the charade, not as part of the deal, but as a man who had finally stopped running. Inside the house, the family watched from the window, and for once, no one had anything to say. That night, the press coverage had shifted. Headlines now read, Billionaire Ethan Hartwell defends mystery wife. She saved me, says Hartwell of private retreat. Romance or scandal? The billionaire who chose love. Sophie scrolled through them in disbelief. You just made me the most talked about woman in the country, she muttered. Ethan smiled faintly. Good. Now they all know you're mine. And despite herself, Sophie felt her lips curve into a smile. For the first time since this whole thing began, she wasn't scared. She was ready. The house was quiet that night. For the first time since the chaos had begun, the reporters had pulled back, content with the statement Ethan had given earlier. The security team still patrolled the gate, but the atmosphere felt different, less hostile, less frantic. Sophie stood barefoot in the kitchen, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Her mind was still reeling. Everything had happened so fast. The reveal, the press, Ethan's public declaration. She should have been panicking, terrified of what tomorrow's headlines might bring. But strangely, she felt lighter. Maybe it was because for the first time since this all began, she knew where Ethan stood. No more half-truths. No more guessing. No more pretending. Can't sleep? Sophie jumped at the sound of Ethan's voice. He stood in the doorway, shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie long gone. His hair was slightly tousled, and there was something softer about him tonight. Less of the confident billionaire, more the man she had first met in that little cafe. Not really, she admitted. Too much noise in my head. He crossed the kitchen slowly and poured himself a glass of water. For a moment, they stood in silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Finally, Sophie set her mug down and turned to face him. Why did you really come to that cafe? She asked quietly. Ethan hesitated, then leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Because I was tired, he said simply. Tired? Tired of being Ethan Hartwell, heir to Hartwell Global. Tired of business meetings that never end. Of people smiling at me while secretly calculating how much they could gain by being in my life. Tired of being a headline. I just wanted a few days to be a man who could sit in a cafe without anyone recognizing him. Sophie's heart ached. And then you showed up, Ethan continued, his voice softening. A complete stranger who looked like she was about to cry into her coffee. And instead of treating me like a name on a magazine cover, you treated me like just some guy. Sophie swallowed hard. I wasn't exactly at my best that day. You were exactly what I needed that day, he said simply. Her breath caught. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie took a deep breath. When I asked you to pretend to be my husband, I thought you'd say no. I was desperate, but I figured no one in their right mind would say yes to a crazy idea like that. And yet, here we are, Ethan said with a small smile. Yeah, Sophie said, her voice catching. Here we are. And now the entire country thinks I married a billionaire for his money. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze steady. Let them think what they want. I know the truth. And so does your family. That's what matters. Sophie looked down at the floor, her fingers twisting together. I spent so much of my life trying to be perfect, to make sure no one ever had a reason to judge me. And then you came along, and suddenly everything was out of my control. Does that scare you? Ethan asked softly. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, gently tilting her chin so she had to look at him. It scares me, too. Her breath hitched. This isn't how I plan my life, Ethan said quietly. But I'm done planning. I don't care what anyone says, not the press, not my board, not even my family. I care about you, Sophie. I care about whether you're okay. I care about whether you can trust me again. Something inside her broke open at those words, not in a painful way, but in a freeing way. I want to, she whispered. Ethan's thumb brushed lightly along her jaw. Then let me prove to you that this is real. Sophie's heart pounded as she nodded, unable to speak. They moved to the living room, where the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The room felt warm, intimate. Ethan sat down on the couch, and Sophie curled up next to him without thinking, as though she had been meant to be there all along. For the next hour, they talked, really talked, for the first time. Sophie told him about the night she found out her parents were gone, about the crushing weight of responsibility that had fallen on her shoulders since then, about the endless worry that she would lose the house, the only piece of them she had left. Ethan listened quietly, never interrupting, his hand covering hers. When she finished, he told her about his world, about the constant pressure of being the face of a billion-dollar company, the isolation of never knowing who to trust, the loneliness that came from being admired but never really known. By the time the fire had burned down to ash, they were both quiet, just sitting together, breathing in sync. You know what's crazy? Sophie said finally, her voice soft. What? I don't think this feels fake anymore. Ethan's lips curved into a slow smile. Good, because I don't want to pretend with you ever again. Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her, slow, unhurried, deep. There was no audience this time, no act to keep up, no cameras, just them. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie rested her forehead against his chest, her heart steady for the first time in days. Maybe this hadn't been part of her plan, but maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she was meant to find. For the first time since the chaos began, Sophie woke up smiling. The memory of last night was warm and steady in her chest. The quiet living room, Ethan's arms around her, the way he'd kissed her like she wasn't just a temporary part of his life, but someone he wanted in it forever. But the peace didn't last long. By mid-morning, the Hartwell Global Security team had arrived in full force, and with them came Ethan's head of PR, a polished woman named Lydia with sharp heels and an even sharper tongue. Ethan, she said briskly, we need to talk. Now. Sophie had been standing nearby, but Lydia barely spared her a glance. We have a board meeting in 48 hours, Lydia continued, flipping open a sleek tablet. The press coverage has already driven our stock down 3 points. Shareholders are demanding answers. We need to get ahead of this scandal before it becomes unmanageable. This isn't a scandal, Ethan said calmly. Public opinion thinks otherwise, Lydia said coolly. We need to craft a narrative, hold a press conference, reassure investors that you haven't completely lost your mind by marrying a stranger. That's enough. The sharpness in Ethan's tone made the entire room go still. Lydia blinked, momentarily thrown off. Ethan! I said that's enough. He stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. This isn't just a narrative to spin, Lydia. This is my life, and my wife. You will treat her with respect, or you will leave my house. Sophie's breath caught. The room was silent for a beat, then Lydia nodded tightly. Understood, but we still have to face the press. If you refuse to cooperate, they'll assume she manipulated you. They'll go after her family, her background, everything. Ethan glanced at Sophie, his expression softening. Then we won't hide, he said. Meaning? Lydia asked. Meaning, Ethan said slowly, we'll face them together. The press conference was set for that afternoon. Sophie felt sick as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair for what felt like the 100th time. Her grandmother came in quietly and set a steadying hand on her shoulder. You look beautiful, Eleanor said softly. I look terrified, Sophie admitted. her voice cracking. Good, Eleanor said with a wry smile. Means you care. But Sophie, she turned her so they were face to face. Don't forget that man out there went to war with the press for you yesterday. He's not going to let you stand out there alone. That gave Sophie just enough courage to keep moving. When she stepped outside with Ethan, the world exploded into flashes and shouted questions. This time, she didn't flinch when the cameras turned on her. They stood side by side at the podium. Ethan spoke first, reiterating what he had told the press the day before, that their marriage was real, that it had not been orchestrated for publicity, that Sophie was not to be vilified. Then, to Sophie's surprise, he stepped back and gestured for her to speak. Her stomach lurched, but she took a deep breath and faced the crowd. My name is Sophie Lane, she said clearly. Yes, I married Ethan Hartwell. Yes, it happened quickly. And no, I didn't do it for money or fame or power. I did it because I needed someone to stand by my side, and he said yes. At first, we thought we were pretending, but somewhere along the way, we stopped pretending. We found something real, and I won't apologize for that. For a long moment, the crowd was silent. Then the questions began again, a storm of voices. But this time, Sophie didn't shrink back. Ethan stayed beside her, his hand brushing hers, grounding her. By the time it was over, she felt like she could finally breathe again. But the battle wasn't over. That evening, Ethan's father called. You've caused quite the stir, son, Mr. Hartwell said, his voice crisp over speakerphone. Your little stunt has the entire board worried. It wasn't a stunt, Ethan said evenly. You married a stranger in the middle of nowhere without so much as a prenup. Because I love her. The line went silent. You love her? His father repeated, incredulous. Yes, Ethan said firmly. And if the board can't handle that, then they'll have to handle running Hartwell Global without me. Sophie's head snapped up. Ethan. He glanced at her, his expression calm. I meant what I said. His father sputtered, clearly taken aback. But Ethan ended the call before the conversation could escalate. You'd really walk away? Sophie whispered. If it came down to choosing between my company and you. Ethan stepped closer, taking her hands. I'd choose you every time. Her heart ached, not from pain, but from something so big and overwhelming she could barely contain it. This man, who could have any life he wanted, was choosing her. And for the first time since this whirlwind began, Sophie finally believed him. You're insane, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Probably, Ethan said with a faint smile. But I'm yours, Sophie, completely. And in that moment, she knew, no matter what happened next, no matter what headlines came tomorrow, they were going to face it together. The following weeks passed in a blur, but this time it wasn't chaos, it was healing. The press eventually moved on to other scandals, though a few persistent reporters still tried to get a scoop on the cafe girl who married a billionaire. Sophie no longer panicked when she saw her face online. If anything, she smiled. She no longer felt like a fraud, because now she was Ethan's wife, not just by accident or circumstance, but by choice. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan took her to the small cafe where they had first met. It was nearly empty, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. I thought we could start over, he said, smiling as he pulled out a chair for her. Properly this time. Sophie laughed softly. You mean, without me begging you to fake marry me? Exactly, he said, sitting across from her. This time, I'd like to do it right. Before Sophie could ask what he meant, Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her heart stopped. I know we already said I do, Ethan said, his voice steady, but we never really had a beginning, not one that was just ours. So, Sophie Lane. He opened the box, revealing a ring that caught the morning light and glittered like something out of a dream. Will you marry me? For real this time. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Yes, she whispered, nodding furiously. Yes, I will. The other patrons in the cafe clapped, and Sophie laughed through her tears as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. This feels different, she said softly, staring at the ring. It is different. Ethan said, leaning across the table to kiss her hand. This time, we're not pretending. This time, we're building something real. Their second wedding was small but perfect. Just family, a few close friends, and no reporters in sight. Sophie wore a simple ivory dress that made her look like she had stepped out of a dream. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle, her grandmother beaming proudly from the front row. When they exchanged vows this time, Sophie's hands didn't shake. She looked Ethan straight in the eyes and spoke from her heart. "You've seen me at my most desperate, my most scared," she said softly. "You saw me when I thought I was about to lose everything, and you still chose me. So now, I choose you not just today, but every day after this one." Ethan's voice was low, but sure when he replied, "You made me remember what it feels like to just be a man, not a headline. You gave me something no one else ever has. Not money, not power, not security. You gave me yourself. And I swear I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that." There wasn't a dry eye in the room by the time they kissed. After the ceremony, Sophie found a quiet moment with her grandmother, who hugged her tightly. "You look so much like your mother today," Eleanor said softly. "She'd be so proud of you." Sophie blinked back tears. "I just wish she could have been here." "She is here," Eleanor said, pressing a hand to Sophie's heart. "You brought her with you. You've made this house a home again, Sophie. You've made this family whole again." For the first time in years, Sophie believed her. Life with Ethan wasn't always easy. There were board meetings, press events, and the occasional tabloid story to deal with. But now, Sophie faced them all with her head high. She even started her own small business, turning the front room of her family's old house into a cozy cafe and bakery, a place where anyone could come in and feel at home. She named it The Lane, and every morning Ethan stopped by on his way to work just to sit at the counter and drink his coffee like an ordinary man. Their marriage became more than a love story. It became a partnership. They didn't just share a house. They shared dreams, decisions, late-night worries, and quiet mornings. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan reached for her hand. "Do you ever think about how insane this all was?" he asked with a grin. "All the time," Sophie said, laughing. "I mean, who marries a stranger to save a house?" "You do," Ethan said, kissing her temple. "And thank God for that." Sophie leaned against him, her heart full, because in the end, the story wasn't about an accidental marriage or a billionaire falling for an ordinary girl. It was about two people who took a risk, who faced down the world together, and who chose, again and again, to love each other despite everything. And that was the truest kind of forever.